Every single year, thousands of people pack their bags, leave their homes in South Asia, and line up outside embassies for a chance to live, work, or study in the UK, United Kingdom. We look at the West today as a pinnacle of wealth, order, and prosperity. But history has a dark, twisted sense of irony because 400 years ago, the flow of desire was completely reversed. 400 years ago, the richest, most coveted destination on this planet was right here. This land was not a land of poverty waiting to be civilized. It was the ultimate economic powerhouse of the globe. When the British first arrived on our shores in the early 17th century, the Indian subcontinent was producing nearly 30% of the entire world's gross domestic product. Nearly one third of all global wealth was generated by our weavers, our farmers, our shipbuilders, and our merchants. Yet, by 1947, when the British finally packed their flags and departed, that staggering 30% had been systematically eviscerated. They left behind a land where the share of global GDP had plummeted to less than 3%. They left a population with a literacy rate of just 16%, a life expectancy of barely 32 years, and an economy entirely broken, bleeding, and dependent. How does an empire reduce the richest corner of the earth into one of its poorest in less than 2 centuries? It wasn't an accident of history. It was the result of a deliberate, ruthless, and highly organized plunder. This is a story of how a corporate entity, the East India Company, and later the British Crown systematically dismantled, piece by piece, every single thriving industry of the subcontinent to fuel the rise of modern Britain. To understand this destruction, we have to start with the crown jewel of our historical economy, the textile industry. Before the British advent, the subcontinent's handloom industry was the envy of the world. Our weavers produced cotton and exquisite muslin of such unimaginable quality that Roman emperors used to complain about their gold flowing into India to buy it. The world dressed itself in our fabrics. When the British took control of Bengal, they realized they could not compete with the quality, efficiency, and skill of our weavers. So they did not just compete, they destroyed the competition by force. The British imposed massive, extortionate tariffs of up to 70 to 80% on Indian textiles entering Britain, while forcing our markets to accept British made machine goods with virtually zero duties. But it went far beyond unfair trade laws. The British literally smashed the looms in Bengal. British agents systematically cut off the thumbs of master weavers so they could never again produce the legendary muslin that the world craved. They criminalized the independent practice of weaving, forcing artisans to work exclusively for the East India Company for starvation wages. Within a few decades, thriving weaving hubs like Dhaka and Murshidabad were turned into ghost towns. The British intentionally deindustrialized the subcontinent, turning a world-class exporter of finished luxury goods into a helpless raw material exporter that grew cotton for the mills of Lancashire and bought back the finished clothes at inflated prices. The destruction did not stop at textiles. Look at the shipping and shipbuilding industry. For centuries, the subcontinent boasted one of the most advanced naval architecture traditions in the world. Our ships, built from robust Malabar teak, were far more durable, seaworthy, and cheaper to maintain than anything built in Europe. Even the British Navy admitted that Indian-built ships were vastly superior to their own oak vessels. Seeing this as a direct threat to British maritime dominance, the British Parliament passed the Registry Acts of 1813 and 1815. These laws outright banned Indian-built ships from trading with Europe and decreed that no ship could enter British ports unless it was manned by a crew that was at least three-quarters British. Indian sailors were systematically barred, and our legendary shipbuilding yards in places like Surat, Bengal, and Western India were forced to close down. An industry that could have naturally evolved into a massive modern naval power was intentionally suffocated to ensure that British shipping companies maintained a global monopoly. Then came the systematic extraction of our agricultural wealth through a brutal, unyielding taxation system. Before the British, land revenue in India was flexible. If there was a drought, a flood, or a bad harvest, the local rulers would reduce or entirely waive the taxes. The British changed the rules of the game entirely. They introduced systems like the permanent settlement of Bengal, turning traditional tax collectors into landlords and commodifying the very earth beneath our feet. The British demanded taxes in cash, and they demanded them regardless of the weather, rain or drought, abundance or famine. The tax had to be paid. To pay these fixed cash taxes, our farmers were forced to stop growing food, crops like rice and wheat, and instead cultivate commercial cash crops that the British needed for global trade: indigo, opium, and cotton. This forced commercialization of agriculture completely destroyed the subcontinent's food security. When the rains failed, there were no grain reserves left. There was only opium and indigo, which you cannot eat. The result was a series of catastrophic man made famine that wiped out millions of lives. The Great Bengal Famine of 1770 took the lives of 10 million people, one third of the population of Bengal, while the East India Company violently continued to collect its revenues and even increased tax rates to ensure their profits didn't suffer. And this cruelty reached its absolute peak nearly 2 centuries later, during the horrific Bengal famine of 1943. While over 3 million people starved to death on the streets of Calcutta, the British government under Winston Churchill actively diverted grain away from starving Indians to build up stockpiles for European soldiers and Greek civilians. When sympathetic officials begged Churchill to release food supplies to save millions of dying subjects, his response was a chilling testament to imperial apathy. He asked, "If food is so scarce, why hasn't Gandhi died yet?" He blamed Indians for their own starvation, saying, "They breed like rabbits." The wealth of our fields was treated as imperial property, while the people who tilled it were treated as entirely disposable. Even our traditional systems of governance, education, and community resilience were systematically torn down. Before the British arrival, the subcontinent's villages operated through a highly functional, decentralized system of self governance. Every village had its own web of artisans, schools, and local dispute resolution bodies that kept communities cohesive. The British replaced this organic structure with a heavily centralized, alien, bureaucratic apparatus designed solely for one purpose: extraction. They dismantled the traditional village schools, which had provided widespread practical literacy to various segments of society long before Britain had a public education system of its own. In its place, they instituted an educational framework explicitly designed, in the words of Thomas Babington Macaulay, to create a class of persons who were Indian in blood and color, but English in taste, in opinions, in morals, and in intellect. They did not educate us to empower us. They educated us to create subservient clerks to manage their own empire. The legal system they brought with them was entirely foreign, expensive, and heavily weighted against the native population. For centuries, the subcontinent had a complex, fluid legal tradition that adapted to local realities. The British codified and rigidified laws in a way that exacerbated communal divisions and left ordinary people completely vulnerable to exploitation by wealthy landlords and British officials alike. We are often told in modern defenses of colonialism that the British gave us the railways. We are told that even if the exploitation, they left behind a massive modern infrastructure that knitted the subcontinent together. But let us look at the reality behind the myth of the Indian railways. The railways were never built for the benefit of the Indian people. They were built as an efficient extraction pipeline and a military tool. The rail lines were deliberately designed to connect the raw material producing hinterland directly to the major ports like Bombay, Calcutta, and Madras, so resources could be shipped out of the country as fast as possible. They were also designed to move British troops quickly to suppress any local rebellions. Furthermore, The construction of the railways was a colossal financial scam perpetrated against Indian taxpayers. British private investors were invited to build the railways under a system where the colonial government guaranteed them a 5% return on their investment, completely paid for out of Indian tax revenues. Because their returns were guaranteed by our money, British companies had absolutely no incentive to be efficient. They built the most expensive, gold plated, and wasteful railway system imaginable. It was described at the time as private enterprise at public risk. While Indian taxpayers bore the entire financial burden, they were treated with utter contempt on the very trains they paid for. Indians were jammed into squalid, unventilated third class carriages, while British officials travelled in luxury. Even the freight charges were rigid. It cost less to ship goods from interior of India to London than it did to ship goods between two Indian cities. The railways were not a gift. They were a steel grid of exploitation clamped onto the body of subcontinent. The ultimate mechanism of this 200-year plunder was what economists call the drain of wealth. Every single year, a massive portion of subcontinent's tax revenues and economic surplus was transferred directly to London without any equivalent return. This drain took many forms. It was hidden under the innocent sounding title of home charges, which included the salaries and pensions of British administrators, the cost of running the India office in London, and the interest on debts that Britain had incurred to fund its own imperial wars of conquest. Yes, the subcontinent was forced to pay for its own conquest. When the British fought wars in Afghanistan, in Burma, in China, or in Europe, the blood spilled might have been mixed, but the money spent came directly from the pockets of Indian peasants. Even the trade surplus that the subcontinent consistently maintained with the rest of the world due to its valuable commodities was intercepted. The gold and foreign currency earned by our exports never made it back to our shores. Instead, it was kept in London to balance Britain's own trade deficits with the rest of the world. It is estimated that between 1765 and 1938, the total drain of wealth from the subcontinent to Britain amounted to a staggering $45 trillion in today's money. This massive, unimaginable transfusion of wealth directly underwrote the Industrial Revolution, built Britain's grand cities, funded its scientific advancements, and established it as a global superpower, while systematically draining the lifeblood out of our homeland. When the British finally realized they could no longer hold on to the subcontinent after the devastation of the Second World War, they did not leave gracefully. Their final act of malice was the absolute destruction of our unity. For 2 centuries, the British had survived and ruled through the conscious strategy of divide and rule. Whenever they saw the diverse communities of this land uniting, they actively stoked religious, ethnic, and caste lines to keep the population fractured and distracted. They institutionalized these divisions through separate electorates and biased census metrics, turning fluid historical coexistence into rigid political rivalries. And when they drew the final borders of departure in 1947, they did it with a breathtaking criminal carelessness. Cyril Radcliffe, a man who had never set foot in the subcontinent and knew nothing of its geography, culture, or people, was given just a few weeks to draw the boundary lines on a map using outdated maps and census data. The result of that hurried pen stroke was partition, the single largest mass migration in human history. Over 15 million people were suddenly displaced, torn from their ancestral homes, forced to flee across newly made borders in an atmosphere of unspeakable violence, panic, and bloodshed. Up to 2 million innocent men, women, and children lost their lives in the communal madness that followed. Families were destroyed, friendships were severed, and a deep, bleeding geopolitical wound was carved into the subcontinent. A wound that continues to drain our resources, fuel conflicts, and divide brothers to this very day. This is the true cost of British Empire. It is not found in the grand architecture of London, nor is it justified by the gift of the English language or a railway network. The true legacy of colonialism is a deliberate conversion of a thriving, wealthy, culturally rich, and economically dominant civilization into a fragmented, impoverished region struggling to rebuild itself from the ashes of exploitation. When we look back at that 30% global GDP, we shouldn't view it merely as a static form from a bygone era. It is proof of what our people, our land, and our intellect are capable of when they are not shackled by foreign exploitation. It took 200 years of systematic plunder to bring this great subcontinent to its knees. Today, as we watch our nations grow, innovate, and steadily climb back onto the global stage, we are not achieving something new. We are simply reclaiming what was always ours. We are reclaiming our place in the world, a place that was stolen from us in an era of absolute darkness.